The sun was setting over Cedar Grove, casting long shadows across the quiet streets of this tight-knit community. Sheriff James Carson, a man who had dedicated 2 decades of his life to protecting these very streets, adjusted his rearview mirror as he drove his cherished black Mustang. It was a rare day when he chose to take his personal car instead of the standard-issue patrol vehicle. Carson had earned every bit of respect he commanded in Cedar Grove. Starting as a rookie officer at 23, he'd worked his way up through the ranks, solving cases that others deemed impossible and building trust with the community along the way. His fellow officers often joked that he could spot trouble from a mile away, but today, trouble would find him in the most unexpected way. The evening had started normally enough. He was heading home after visiting his mother in the neighboring town, looking forward to a quiet dinner and maybe catching the game on TV. His Mustang, a car he'd saved up for years to buy, purred smoothly along the back roads he knew like the back of his hand. The dashboard clock read 6:45 p.m. when Carson first noticed the flashing lights in his rearview mirror. At first, he thought it must be one of his deputies responding to a call, but as the patrol car drew closer, he realized these were officers he didn't recognize. Being in his personal vehicle and out of uniform, Carson calmly pulled over, reaching for his wallet where he kept his badge and ID. What happened next would become the talk of Cedar Grove for years to come. 2 young officers, their badges gleaming in the fading sunlight, approached his car with an aggression that seemed out of place for a routine traffic stop. Carson could tell right away these weren't local boys. Their uniforms belonged to the neighboring district, and their demeanor suggested they were fresh out of the academy. As Carson rolled down his window, the crisp evening air carried the scent of pine needles and something else: tension. The lead officer's hand was already resting on his holster, a detail that didn't escape Carson's trained eye. 20 years of experience had taught him to read situations like this, and something wasn't adding up. License and registration, the first officer demanded, his voice carrying a hint of unnecessary authority. Carson reached slowly for his documents, maintaining a calm demeanor despite the officer's aggressive tone. He could have revealed his identity right then, but years of experience had taught him valuable lessons about understanding how his officers treated regular citizens. The interior light of his Mustang illuminated the leather seats and spotless dashboard. Carson had always taken pride in maintaining his vehicle, which made what was about to unfold even more shocking. As he handed over his license, he noticed the second officer circling his car, flashlight beam dancing across the pristine paintwork. "Step out of the vehicle," the first officer ordered, hardly glancing at the ID in his hand. Carson complied, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He'd trained countless officers on proper traffic stop procedures, and these 2 were breaking protocol in ways that made his skin crawl. The evening air had grown cooler, and a small crowd of curious onlookers had begun to gather at a safe distance. Carson stood silently, watching as the officers called for backup, claiming they had a suspicious vehicle with a non-compliant driver. He almost smiled at the irony. If they had only run his license properly, they would have known exactly who he was. More patrol cars arrived, their lights painting the gathering dusk in alternating red and blue. Carson remained silent, observing as the situation spiraled further out of control. He recognized this as a teaching moment, albeit one that would come at a personal cost. The gathering crowd of residents included Mrs. Thompson from the local bakery, who had known Carson since he was a rookie, and old Mr. Jenkins, who walked his dog along this route every evening. Their confused whispers added to the tension in the air as they watched their sheriff being treated like a common criminal. The coolness of the evening was punctuated by the crackle of radio traffic and the murmur of confused bystanders. Carson's Mustang sat silently, its black paint reflecting the chaos of emergency lights, unaware it was about to become the center of an incident that would shake the foundations of law enforcement in Cedar Grove. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Carson watched the situation unfold with the patience of a man who knew that sometimes the hardest lessons were the most important ones to learn. He stood tall, his presence commanding even without his uniform, waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth that would turn this entire situation on its head. The first chapter of this story was about to close, but the real drama was just beginning. The actions these officers would take next would not only cost them their badges, but would also lead to one of the most significant reforms in Cedar Grove's police department history. As more backup arrived and the tension continued to build, Carson knew that this evening would be remembered for years to come, not just in Cedar Grove, but in police academies across the state. Little did these officers know that their next actions would not only destroy a car, but would also shatter their careers and change law enforcement training forever. The night was young, and this story was far from over. The confrontation at the roadside was growing more intense with each passing minute. The two officers, their inexperience showing in every move they made, had created a situation that was spinning rapidly out of control. The lead officer's face was flushed with what seemed like a mix of authority and uncertainty, while his partner kept pacing around Carson's Mustang, shining his flashlight into every corner. "Sir, we have reason to believe this vehicle is involved in suspicious activities," the lead officer announced, his voice carrying across the growing crowd of onlookers. Carson raised an eyebrow but maintained his silence. As a veteran of countless traffic stops, he knew exactly what proper procedure looked like, and this wasn't it. The evening air had grown colder, and more patrol cars continued to arrive. The quiet back road had transformed into an impromptu command center, with at least 6 police vehicles now surrounding Carson's Mustang. Their flashing lights created an almost carnival-like atmosphere, reflecting off nearby windows and illuminating the concerned faces of the gathering townspeople. One of the newly arrived officers, clearly trying to take charge of the situation, approached Carson with a drug-sniffing dog. The dog, however, showed no interest in the car, walking past it without any indication of suspicious substances. This should have been the first clue that something wasn't adding up, but the officers seemed determined to find something, anything, to justify their aggressive approach. "The dog's probably tired," muttered one officer to another, loud enough for Carson to hear. He had to suppress a smile at the ridiculous justification. As sheriff, he'd seen officers make mistakes before, but this was quickly becoming a textbook example of how not to handle a traffic stop. The crowd of spectators had grown larger, and Carson could hear their whispered conversations. "Isn't that the sheriff's car?" one person asked. "Why aren't they checking his ID properly?" wondered another. But the officers were too caught up in their power trip to notice the mounting tension among the onlookers. The lead officer's next move was to declare the vehicle needed to be searched. Without proper cause or warrant, they began a thorough inspection of Carson's pristine Mustang. They'd pulled out seat cushions, rifled through his glove compartment, and even attempted to pry up carpet edges. Carson watched calmly as they dismantled the interior of his prized possession, documenting everything with his phone's camera. "We've got something," shouted the second officer triumphantly, pulling out a small bag from under the passenger seat. Carson's eyes narrowed. He knew his car was clean, and the sudden discovery of evidence was concerning. The bag, as it turned out, was nothing more than an empty sandwich wrapper from his lunch earlier that day. But the officers weren't ready to admit their mistake. Instead, they doubled down. "This wrapper could have contained illegal substances," the lead officer declared, holding it up like a trophy. The absurdity of the situation would have been comical if it weren't so serious. More concerning was how they began treating Carson's silence as an admission of guilt. "If you've got nothing to hide, why aren't you defending yourself?" they taunted. Little did they know, every moment of their unprofessional behavior was being carefully observed and mentally noted by someone who had trained officers for 2 decades. The situation reached a new level of tension when one officer claimed he could smell something suspicious. This despite the fact that the drug dog had shown no interest, and Carson's car was known throughout town for being meticulously maintained. The crowd had grown restless, with some residents trying to speak up about knowing the car's owner. But the officers, caught up in their own narrative, brushed aside these attempts at clarification. Their radios crackled with chatter as they called in for more backup, describing a situation that existed only in their imagination. As the evening wore on, the officers' frustration at finding nothing illegal began to show. Their actions became more aggressive, their accusations more outlandish. They started talking about impounding the vehicle, citing regulations that Carson knew didn't exist. The lead officer's face was now red with frustration, his earlier confidence replaced by a desperate need to justify their actions. His partner kept looking nervously at the growing crowd, perhaps beginning to sense that something about this situation wasn't quite right. Carson continued to stand quietly, his experienced eyes taking in every detail. He watched as these officers dug themselves deeper and deeper into a hole of their own making. Their next action would cross a line that would change everything, not just for them, but for police departments across the state. The air was thick with tension as one officer pulled out his radio again, requesting permission for something that would prove to be the biggest mistake of their careers. The crowd fell silent, sensing that something dramatic was about to unfold. Even the evening crickets seemed to pause their chirping, as if waiting to witness what would happen next. No one in Cedar Grove would ever forget what happened in the next few minutes. The officer's next decision would not only destroy property but would also serve as a wake-up call about the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of proper police training. As the officers huddled together, planning their next move, Carson knew that the real show was about to begin. The tension in the air reached its breaking point as the lead officer received a response on his radio. With a smug look of satisfaction, he turned to face Carson, who remained calm despite the chaos unfolding around him. The gathering crowd watched in stunned silence as more police vehicles arrived, their sirens cutting through the peaceful evening air. Based on suspicious activity and potential evidence destruction, the lead officer announced loudly, clearly playing to his audience of fellow officers, "We're declaring this vehicle a hazard. It needs to be destroyed immediately." The words hung in the air like a heavy storm cloud, drawing gasps from the onlookers. Carson's eyes widened slightly. This was far beyond what he'd expected. In his 20 years of law enforcement, he'd never heard of such an outrageous decision. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, with several residents trying to step forward to speak up. But the officers had created a perimeter, keeping everyone at a distance. "You can't do this," shouted someone from the crowd. "That's not even legal," called another voice. But the officers were lost in their own world of misguided authority, ignoring the protests of the townspeople who knew better. The lead officer pulled out a notepad, hastily scribbling what he claimed was an official destruction order. His partner, looking increasingly uncertain, kept glancing between Carson and the crowd. Something about the situation was finally starting to feel wrong to him, but he remained silent, following his partner's lead. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Two officers approached Carson's beloved Mustang with containers of gasoline they'd retrieved from their patrol cars. The crowd's protests grew louder, but the officers pressed on, convinced they were following some imaginary protocol. Carson watched as they began dousing his car with gasoline, the liquid gleaming in the emergency lights that continued to flash. He could have stopped them at any moment by revealing his identity, but he knew this had become something bigger than just a car. This was about exposing a dangerous lack of training and accountability. The smell of gasoline filled the air as the officers stepped back, looking pleased with themselves. The lead officer pulled out a flare, holding it up like some sort of twisted trophy. "Stand back," he ordered, his voice carrying a hint of excitement that made several other officers shift uncomfortably. The crowd had fallen into a horrified silence. Even those officers who had arrived later seemed unsure about what they were witnessing. One young officer actually took a step forward as if to stop it, but a sharp look from the lead officer made him retreat. Carson stood perfectly still, his phone continuing to record every moment. He noticed how some of the more experienced officers who had arrived later were exchanging worried glances. They knew something wasn't right, but the chain of command and the momentum of the situation kept them from speaking up. The flare ignited with a sharp hiss, casting an eerie red glow across the scene. Time seemed to slow down as the lead officer pulled back his arm, preparing to throw it. In that moment, several things happened at once. Someone in the crowd screamed, a dog started barking, and the uncertain partner finally found his voice. "Wait," he called out, but it was too late. The flare arced through the air, leaving a trail of sparks before landing near the gas-soaked vehicle. The flames caught instantly, and Carson's Mustang was engulfed in seconds. The heat pushed everyone back, and the orange glow illuminated faces filled with shock and disbelief. The fire seemed to dance in the evening air, consuming the car that Carson had maintained so carefully over the years. Photos of his family in the glove compartment, his favorite leather jacket in the back seat, all of it was being destroyed because of a completely unauthorized and illegal action. As the flames rose higher, something changed in the atmosphere. The lead officer's triumphant expression began to fade as reality started setting in. His partner had backed away, looking sick. Other officers were pulling out their phones, some likely calling their superiors, others documenting what they were witnessing. The fire department's sirens could be heard in the distance, but everyone knew they wouldn't arrive in time to save the car. The damage was done, and not just to the vehicle. The officers had crossed a line that would have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. Carson took a deep breath, knowing it was time. He reached into his pocket, feeling the familiar shape of his badge. The next few moments would change everything. Careers would end, policies would be rewritten, and the entire department would be forced to face some uncomfortable truths about power and responsibility. The flames continued to consume his car, but Carson knew that from these ashes would rise something important. A lesson about accountability and the true meaning of law enforcement. As he prepared to reveal his identity, he could already imagine the looks on their faces when they realized exactly who they had been dealing with all this time. The flames from Carson's burning Mustang lit up the night sky, casting an orange glow over the shocked faces of everyone present. The lead officer stood there, flare launcher still in hand, a look of satisfaction slowly morphing into uncertainty as he watched the inferno. The moment had come for Carson to end this charade. With deliberate slowness, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his badge. The gold shield caught the firelight, gleaming as he held it up. "Evening, officers," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 20 years of authority. "I'm Sheriff James Carson. I believe we need to have a serious discussion about proper police procedure." The effect was immediate and dramatic. The lead officer's face drained of all color, his confident posture crumbling as the badge's significance registered. His partner actually stumbled backward, nearly tripping over his own feet. The other officers present froze, their expressions a mix of horror and disbelief. That's impossible," the lead officer stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "We would have known." But they hadn't known because they hadn't bothered to run a proper check on his license or listen to the townspeople trying to tell them. The crowd that had gathered burst into movement. People were pulling out phones, recording everything. Mrs. Thompson from the bakery was already on her phone, presumably calling the local news. The whispers had turned into a loud buzz of conversation, punctuated by phrases like, "They're in trouble now," and "Can't believe they did that to the sheriff's car." Carson walked calmly toward the group of officers, his badge still visible in his hand. The fire department's sirens were getting closer, but the damage to his car was already done. The heat from the flames could still be felt as he approached the officers who had just destroyed his property. "Sir, aren't we?" the lead officer tried to speak, but words failed him. His partner had turned an interesting shade of green, likely realizing the full implications of what they had just done. The other officers present began backing away, trying to distance themselves from the two who had initiated this disaster. "Let's start with the basics," Carson said, his voice level but firm. "Can either of you cite the regulation that gives you the authority to destroy a civilian's vehicle without due process?" The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the crackling of flames and the approaching fire trucks. The local news van pulled up just then, adding to the chaos. A reporter jumped out, camera already rolling, capturing the scene of the burning car, the shell-shocked officers, and the sheriff standing calmly in the middle of it all. Carson turned to address all the officers present. "This is what happens when we forget our training, when we let power go to our heads, when we fail to follow basic procedures." His words carried across the scene, making several officers bow their heads in shame. The fire department finally arrived, their trucks pulling up with lights flashing. As they began to battle the blaze, Carson continued his impromptu lesson. "Every person we stop is someone's family member. Every car we inspect belongs to a citizen with rights. Tonight, you destroyed property without cause, ignored proper procedure, and violated multiple departmental policies." The lead officer had sunk onto the curb, his head in his hands. His partner was leaning against a patrol car, looking like he might be sick. The other officers present were already on their phones, likely calling their supervisors to report what had happened. More media vehicles were arriving now, drawn by calls from the spectators. Camera flashes lit up the night alongside the dying fire as firefighters brought the blaze under control. Carson's Mustang was now a blackened shell, steam rising from its frame as water from the fire hoses hit the hot metal. "Tomorrow morning," Carson announced, I want both of you in my office at 8 a.m. sharp. Bring your badges and your union representatives." The two officers nodded weakly, knowing their careers were likely over. As if on cue, several senior department officials began arriving, their faces grave as they took in the scene. The local police chief, who reported to Carson, looked like he had aged 10 years in the last 10 minutes as he hurried over. The crowd had grown even larger, with people filming everything on their phones. Social media would be buzzing with this story within minutes. Carson knew this incident would become a teaching moment for police departments across the country, an example of what happens when authority is abused and proper procedure is ignored. As the flames died down and the full impact of what had happened began to sink in, Carson noticed the changes in the officers around him. The arrogance was gone, replaced by shame and regret. Sometimes the hardest lessons were the ones best remembered, and tonight's lesson would not be forgotten anytime soon. The events of this evening would lead to major changes in police training and oversight. But right now, as Carson watched the last flames being extinguished, he knew that the real work was just beginning. This wasn't just about a destroyed car anymore. It was about ensuring that something like this never happened again. The next morning arrived with a buzz of activity at the Cedar Grove Police Department. By 7:30 a.m., news vans lined the street outside, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension as officers and staff went about their duties, all too aware of the meeting about to take place. The two officers from the previous night's incident arrived separately at 7:45 a.m. Both looked like they hadn't slept, their uniforms unusually wrinkled and their faces pale. They sat in the waiting area outside Sheriff Carson's office, avoiding eye contact with everyone who passed by. Their union representatives arrived moments later, folders tucked under their arms, their expressions grim. They'd spent the night reviewing the footage, not just from police body cameras, but from dozens of cell phones in the crowd. The evidence was overwhelming and damning. At exactly 8 a.m., Carson's office door opened. Unlike his usual casual demeanor, he was wearing his full uniform today, every badge and button polished to perfection. "Come in," he said simply, his voice carrying down the quiet hallway. The office was larger than most people expected, with walls covered in commendations and photos from Carson's 20 years of service. The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the conference table where several senior department officials were already seated. "Before we begin," Carson said as everyone took their seats, "I want to show you something." He turned on a large screen mounted on the wall. The footage that began playing was from his own phone, a clear, steady recording of the entire incident from his perspective. The two officers seemed to shrink in their chairs as they watched themselves on screen. Their voices from the previous night sounded strange to them now, arrogant, unprofessional, almost unrecognizable. When the footage reached the moment of the car's destruction, several people in the room winced. "In 20 years of law enforcement," Carson began after stopping the video, "I've never seen a more blatant abuse of power. You didn't just destroy my car, you destroyed public trust. You broke nearly every procedure we have in place for traffic stops." The lead officer tried to speak, but his union representative gently shook his head. The time for explanations had passed. This was about consequences now. "The damage to my vehicle is actually the least of my concerns," Carson continued, leaning forward in his chair. "What troubles me most is what might have happened if I had been an ordinary citizen, someone without the power to defend themselves against this kind of abuse." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the media circus that had gathered. Every news outlet in the state is out there. By noon, this story will be national news. People across the country will be watching to see how we handle this. The department officials began laying out papers, termination notices, legal documents, statements to be signed. The sound of shuffling paper filled the tense silence. However, Carson turned back to face the room. "This isn't just about punishment. This is about learning and changing. Your actions last night exposed serious flaws in our training programs, our oversight procedures, and our departmental culture." The younger of the two officers was quietly crying now, his career dreams crumbling before his eyes. His partner sat stone-faced, but his trembling hands betrayed his emotions. "Starting today, we're implementing a complete overhaul of our training procedures. Every officer in this department will go through extensive retraining. We're bringing in external oversight committees, and we're establishing new protocols for traffic stops and vehicle searches. The union representatives were nodding. They'd seen enough to know this was actually a relatively merciful response, given the circumstances. As for you two, Carson continued, your badges and guns will be surrendered today. But I'm also requiring you to be part of our new training program as examples of what can happen when power is misused. Your experience will help ensure this never happens again. Outside, the media waited eagerly for statements. Inside, papers were signed, badges were surrendered, and tears were shed. But something important was happening, a moment of transformation for the entire department. As the meeting concluded and people began filing out, Carson stopped the younger officer. Remember this feeling, he said quietly. Let it guide you in whatever you do next. Sometimes our biggest mistakes lead to our most important lessons. The story of the sheriff's burned car would indeed make national news, but not for the reasons most expected. It would become a case study in police reform, a catalyst for change, and a reminder that true authority comes not from power, but from how that power is used. The weeks following the incident brought sweeping changes to Cedar Grove and its police department. The story had caught fire across the nation, with major news networks running special reports and social media buzzing with discussions about police accountability and reform. Sheriff Carson found himself at the center of a movement he hadn't planned but knew was necessary. The charred remains of his Mustang had been moved to the Police Academy's training center, serving as a powerful visual reminder for new recruits. Every morning, Carson would walk past it on his way to oversee the department's new training programs, its blackened frame telling a story more effectively than any lecture could. The police department's main conference room had become a hub of activity. Training experts from across the country had arrived to help implement new procedures. The walls were covered with flow charts and procedure diagrams, and the sound of intense discussions filled the air from morning until night. We're not just changing rules, Carson explained to a room full of officers during one session. We're changing how we think about our role in the community. The officers, some still struggling to process the events of that night, listened intently as he shared his experience from the other side of the badge. The local community had rallied around the changes. Town hall meetings, once sparsely attended, were now packed with citizens eager to participate in shaping their police department's future. Even Mrs. Thompson from the bakery had gotten involved, organizing community police dialogue sessions over coffee and pastries. The two former officers who had burned Carson's car had taken different paths. The younger one had enrolled in law school, determined to understand the legal system from a new perspective. His former partner had started working with police accountability groups, sharing his story as a cautionary tale. Local businesses began putting up signs supporting police reform. The town's high school included the incident in its civics curriculum. What had started as a terrible mistake was transforming into a powerful lesson about responsibility and accountability. Carson received invitations to speak at police academies across the state. He would begin each presentation by showing the video from that night, letting the footage speak for itself before discussing the importance of proper training and professional conduct. The hardest part, he'd tell his audiences, wasn't losing my car. It was watching fellow officers forget their fundamental duty to protect and serve. His words resonated with both veteran officers and fresh recruits, sparking important conversations about power and responsibility. The media attention brought unexpected benefits. Other departments began reaching out, eager to learn from Cedar Grove's experience and implement similar reforms. What had happened in this small town was becoming a model for police departments nationwide. The insurance company's response to the incident had been surprisingly swift. They'd not only covered the loss of Carson's Mustang, but had also recommended changes to police department policies regarding property destruction. Their report became another teaching tool in the department's reformed training program. 6 months after the incident, Cedar Grove hosted its first Police Accountability Summit. Law enforcement officials from across the country gathered to discuss best practices and share experiences. The burnt-out shell of Carson's car stood in the lobby, a stark reminder of why they were there. The changes weren't just procedural. Officers reported feeling more connected to their community. Traffic stops became opportunities for positive interaction rather than confrontation. The us versus them mentality that had contributed to the incident was slowly being replaced by a more collaborative approach. In the police station break room, officers could be heard discussing situations differently. What would Sheriff Carson do? Became a common question when facing challenging scenarios. The incident had created a new standard for professional conduct. Local schools invited officers to speak about the importance of accountability and proper procedure. Children learned that true authority comes from respect, not fear. The story of the sheriff's car became a teaching moment about power, responsibility, and consequences. As winter approached, Carson received a letter from a police academy graduate who had heard his story. "Your experience changed how I view my role as an officer," the letter read. "Sometimes the best lessons come from the hardest moments." The town council voted to establish an annual review of police procedures, ensuring that the lessons learned wouldn't fade with time. They named it the Carson Protocol, though the sheriff himself had suggested a less personal title. The incident had sparked a transformation that went beyond just police reform. It had shown how a community could turn a crisis into an opportunity for positive change. As Carson often said, sometimes the best way to move forward is to learn from where we stumbled. 1 year after the incident, Cedar Grove's police department had become a model of reform and community engagement. The story of a burning car had evolved into a lesson about justice, accountability, and the true meaning of serving and protecting the public. 2 years had passed since the night Sheriff Carson's Mustang went up in flames, and Cedar Grove had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The small town had become a beacon of progressive law enforcement, with police departments from across the country sending representatives to learn from their example. On a crisp autumn morning, Carson stood at the podium in the newly built police training center, addressing a room full of eager faces. Behind him, through floor-to-ceiling windows, visitors could see the preserved remains of his burned car, now the centerpiece of a memorial garden dedicated to police reform. "The night my car burned wasn't just about property destruction," Carson began, his voice carrying across the packed auditorium. "It was about what happens when we forget our fundamental purpose as law enforcement officers." The audience, a mix of veteran officers and fresh recruits, listened intently. The changes in Cedar Grove had exceeded everyone's expectations. Crime rates had dropped significantly, not through aggressive policing, but through improved community relations. Officers were now regular fixtures at neighborhood events, building trust rather than inspiring fear. The 2 former officers involved in the incident had become unexpected allies in police reform. The younger one had finished law school and now worked as an advocate for police accountability. His former partner had written a book about his experience, which had become required reading at police academies nationwide. Carson walked through the training center's halls, where photos documented the department's journey. There were images of community meetings, training sessions, and celebrations of success. Each told part of the story of how a crisis had led to positive change. The local coffee shop had become an unofficial hub for police community relations. Officers regularly met with residents there, sharing concerns and ideas over cups of coffee. The owner had even named a blend Sheriff's Justice, dark roast with a smooth finish, just like Carson's approach to law enforcement. The department's new training programs had gained national recognition. They emphasized de-escalation, community engagement, and proper procedure. Role-playing exercises often used the incident with Carson's car as a starting point for discussions about power and responsibility. "We learned that authority isn't about showing power," Carson would tell new recruits. "It's about earning trust." This philosophy had become the foundation of Cedar Grove's approach to law enforcement, reflected in every policy and procedure. The town's annual Police Accountability Festival had become a major event, drawing visitors from across the country. It combined serious discussions about law enforcement with community celebrations, bridging the gap between police and public in ways that once seemed impossible. Carson's office wall now displayed hundreds of letters from officers and citizens alike, sharing how Cedar Grove's example had influenced their communities. Each letter represented a ripple effect of positive change, spreading far beyond the town's borders. The media still occasionally revisited the story, but now they focused on the transformation rather than the incident. Cedar Grove had become a case study in how crisis could lead to positive change when handled with wisdom and determination. In the police academy's classroom, recruits now studied a comprehensive curriculum that balanced technical skills with emotional intelligence. The story of Carson's burned car was just the beginning of lessons about judgment, responsibility, and community trust. The town council had established a civilian oversight committee, ensuring that the reforms would continue long after Carson's retirement. The committee included people from all walks of life, working together to maintain the balance between effective law enforcement and public trust. During community events, Carson would often find himself approached by citizens sharing their own stories of positive interactions with police. Each story confirmed that the painful lessons of that night had led to meaningful change. As sunset painted the sky over Cedar Grove, Carson stood in the memorial garden beside his old Mustang. The charred vehicle, now protected by a clear enclosure, had become a symbol of transformation. A plaque nearby read, "From this fire rose a new understanding of justice and service." The sound of police sirens in Cedar Grove no longer caused anxiety among residents. Instead, it reminded them of the partnership between law enforcement and community that had emerged from that fateful night. The town had proven that positive change was possible, even from the most challenging circumstances. As Carson prepared to end another day at the office, he smiled at a framed photo on his desk. A new Mustang, parked proudly in his driveway. But unlike its predecessor, this car represented not just personal achievement, but the journey of an entire community toward a better understanding of justice and responsibility. The legacy of that night continued to grow, reaching far beyond Cedar Grove's borders. It had become a testament to the power of learning from mistakes, the importance of accountability, and the possibility of turning a crisis into an opportunity for lasting positive change.